Trich und Ehre, was ich dir noch angesäche, so bist du ihr aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschehen? Dass ein Magd ein Kind gebar, ihre über aller Engel Schar. Was das nicht ein Wunder gab.
This is The New Right, a podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary holy land from the heathen. This is Dan Baltic.
And this is Matt Pegas.
And this is episode 80, a real milestone here. And what could be more appropriate for a milestone than to be joined by none other than James Pogue, a contributing editor at Harper's, but many people from our side of the internet will know him as the author of the Vanity Fair article from 2022, which profiled Curtis Yarvin among many others, as well as a follow-up article called The Free Radicals, which profiled, the to not the exact same cast of characters, but examined the libertarian ethos of the American West, and introduced some new characters to the episode arc here. Thank you for coming on the pod, James. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we have a lot to talk about here. And one of the kind of the first things that I thought we might want to get into is, obviously you came across our stream when we read that Vanity Fair article, and to my mind, that was a sort of, and I remember listening to the Good Old Boys podcast. They seem to experience it in the same way. Forgive the phrase, a coming out party for the dissident right, because it was a kind of a profile in the mainstream media that was not a kind of like expose, scary hit piece type article, but an article that was kind of doing an ethnography of what's going on, trying to understand the characters, the drives, the underlying political conditions, and all done in a very lyrical, very readable, dare I say, even Gonzo style. I believe you went to many of the events. You attended the various parties. I believe Amanda Milius figured into it, and a lot of interesting anecdotes. And so that seemed to kind of coincide with I believe Matt and I have discussed there's a party in the Forever Mag party,
right? The
in
Forever
LA,
Mag launch party in LA,
which many people have described as a Delicious Tacos did a reading as a sort of another coming out type event, a vibe shift type event. And so these kind of changes seem to have portend and did create in the popular consciousness, certainly on this side of the internet, but maybe more generally, a so-called vibe shift. And I'm wondering, okay, so we're about 2 years out from that. How has, in your opinion, the vibe shifted? What, if you were to write another article profiling the scene, as it were, where do things stand today in your estimation? if that's not too broad a question.
Excuse me. Excuse me, I gotta clear my throat here. Okay. Yeah, I'm clearing my throat because I'm stalling on that question. The honest truth. So the honest truth is, like, hopefully this is interesting to people, but I came up in what you would call the traditional literary world, right? Like I
Yeah.
came up, and back in the day, like, just to go in, I mean, this is a podcast about publishing and writing to some degree, right? We can talk
Yeah.
about this
Yeah.
stuff. Like,
Absolutely.
when I came up, there was a thing that kind of everybody who wanted to do the stuff that I did, and like a lot of guys in particular, wanted to do the stuff that I'm doing. Not to sound cool, but it was just
Yeah.
long form magazine reporting was kind of the thing. It was like, if you get to do that, you're kind of hitting
Absolutely.
like the dream, right? And the way you did that was pretty simple. I mean, like, you went to, you know, you didn't even have to really necessarily go to a great school, because it was more about like being able to live the lifestyle. And you would come to New York and you would generally do the Harper's internship, maybe a different internship, but the Harper's one was the main one. And then you would go into fact checking, and that taught you the reporting skills, that taught you the phone skills, that taught you how to bother people into talking to you. And it taught you how to really use text in a very precise way, blah, 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 long story short. Maybe women were more so copy editors, guys were more so fact checkers, whatever. And then you would take time off from the magazine because it's a printed schedule. So those editors go on vacation for 10 days after they close the issue. And then you can go report, and you live on a couch and you're making $26 an hour. And that's a lot of money in New York in 2009 or 2009, 2020. Sorry.
Yeah.
And you built a career like that, right? And so there was a little fraternity of people who did that I came up under. I'm describing this because, like, there was an interplay between sort of more commercial, glossy publication, like the mainstream stuff, the big stuff, the stuff that, and the kind of like the cool stuff, and at the time it was the people associated with a number of brand names like N+1 magazine, the Paris Review, FSG, the publisher, Harper's Magazine, the New Yorker, maybe, but like the New Yorker would maybe even be like too normie, too corporate, too Ivy League a little bit. It wasn't cool, right?
Yeah.
But cool was like the people in that little circle. And like, or another way of putting it would be, they were the people who thought they were cool, and they were in enough of a bubble that it felt cool to be in it,
Yeah.
And like, to a large degree, that died in the sudden kind of like political breakdown that we had, I would say even pre-2016, like where it started, the recriminations and the suspicion and the sudden ability that you had to just like dislike somebody and like destroy their life because you spread a rumor or whatever, like that. I was sort of there for feeling that coming, and I was not. We should go into this more because it affected the career of a lot of particularly guys of like around, I'm 37, around my age. Like a lot of people like came in trying to do that thing, and then for various reasons couldn't, and like spun off. And some of them are now big names on the dissident right. I don't want to like blow up anybody's spot, but like the thing that happened to me happened to a lot of people in different ways, right? But so my thing was, I actually left New York after writing a book about the Bundy family, like the guys who took over the wildlife refuge in Oregon. And I left New York for two reasons. One was that I just actually felt like, and again, this isn't even political, but as a man, it's like kind of hard to be a guy in New York. Like there's nothing tangible to do. You don't have like a garage to fix stuff in. It's hard to do sports. Like you live like this life of a mind, just sort of by default to the geography of the city, that was like, it turns you a little neurotic. And it's not, that's just a kind of fact of life. It's difficult to like have a physical male existence. I just hated that part, right? And if you said something like, I had a truck and stuff, and if you told people at a party, like, I'm going to go home and work on my truck, they would look at you like you were doing an act. They would look at you like it was a bit, and for me, it wasn't
masculinity, hipster mustache vibes. Yeah.
And so like, it would become like like just the stuff I like to do was problematized. And I felt that even if it wasn't like part of my politics, even if I wasn't trying to be based or whatever, right?
Yeah.
The other part of it was like this darker thing of like, I was writing more like I considered myself like a future novelist. I considered the magazine stuff a sideline. And like
Yeah.
I was like, I'm gonna, eventually write my big auto-fictional thing about all the adventures that I'd had when I was young and blah, blah, blah. And I sensed around 2014, like, oh, this is not going to work.
Yeah.
And I kind of figured out, like, okay, you can use journalism to get your worldview out and use that as a narrative technique and kind of like not have to deal with trying to work your, male writing into this system because it's just not the freaking time, right?
Yeah.
And so I took off from that thing and basically like looked west and didn't pay attention to anything. So when I set out to write that new Right article, like the reason that it worked is I didn't know anything about Dime Square. I didn't know what Dime Square was, except I listened to Red Scare sometimes. I
Yeah.
wouldn't have known who Amanda Milius was. I didn't know any of this lit scene stuff, Forever Mag, blah, blah, Sovereign House, none of this, all of this stuff that's that scene. Like I got lumped in kind of like as a guy who reports on that stuff. I don't know anything about it. I've been to New
Yeah.
York once in the last 5 years.
Mm.
So like I didn't know anything about M. Crumps, none of that, right?
Yeah.
And so like it's funny because when that article dropped, like the reason it kind of worked was yeah, I was doing a thing. Like, yeah, I know that when I put a piece in a magazine and I don't call the people I'm writing about evil, that like that's already kind of a political decision these days. And like that it's
Yeah.
already like sort of taking a stance. But part of it was that I was just interested. Like I just actually didn't like I interviewed Honor Levy and like listened to Wet Brain, if you guys remember that podcast.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like I interviewed Honor and listened to that and I listened to Good Old Boys and I was just like, oh, there's something happening here that I genuinely did
Absolutely.
not know was going on, right? And like I've never been is this a public podcast? I've never been a liberal. Like I've never been
Yeah.
a liberal, and I don't mean that like I'm super based. I'm super yeah. Like let's bring back Western civilization. Like like
Yeah.
it's not even about that. It's that I just don't think that history is a singular narrative of progress based on
Yeah.
like rational individuals like making rational decisions for the betterment of the world. I don't think that's history how
Yeah.
history works. And so it was really easy for me to meet Curtis Yarvin or something and be like, oh yeah, like we think about history in a similar way. That doesn't mean we come to the same conclusions, but like it felt like part of my project to actually talk about the things they were doing and actually to like again, not in a bad way, but like use these people because I don't want the world to think that like all of this like techno capital
Mm.
craziness that we're living through represents progress. I want to destroy that worldview, whether or not it's from the right or the left or however you want to look at it. I want to destroy that worldview too.
Mm.
And so like it was a little bit of like me using people to kind of advance my worldview more than it was, sometimes people on the right think that it was like me sneakily trying to like elevate the based cause or something. And it was more like I'm trying to get people just like normies to think about narratives of progress and think about like
Yeah.
whether or not this crazy hellish society we live in is actually the best option. And if we have to use right-wing people to do it, cool, that's fine. Like it's just they're
Yeah.
talking about it more, and so that was my funny thing about the scene. And like it was cool for me because I just don't go to a lot of parties anymore. I like to party, don't worry. But like I'm just LA is very isolated from
It
things.
is.
And so like I went to a Forever Mag party the one time I went to New York recently, and I was like, whoa, like this is wild,
Yeah.
because it was like guys in suits I mean, you know these guys, like guys from First Things and Compact, like dressed up in suits and bow ties and blah, 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 like looking real prim, and then you have these girls wearing this, and then like Leslie Jameson is there reading. And that was weird because it's like, does Leslie know like what this scene represents to other people? Because she's like the queen of normie, sort of like
Yeah,
late millennial liberal woman literature and stuff. And she's reading. And actually, I just kind of thought that was cool. Like, I think it's cool to have like Dean Kissick there, Leslie Jameson there, like a bunch of
absolutely.
girls wearing things that absolutely shocked me to see because I'm suddenly old. And then like,
Yeah.
the prim and proper like think tank boys, like that's a cool thing actually to be mixed up in. And because I'm a little bit removed from it, I guess I'm actually not that cynical about it. So like I see people talking about Times Square or like whatever this scene is and like all that stuff and like how boring it is, how over it is, how dead New York is, blah, 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 blah. Maybe that's true, but like, I guess I'm sort of in a privileged position of like, I dip into it and I see it sometimes and I think, hey, this is more interesting than like most parties I go to. So like, enjoy it. Like, well,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't see why everybody has to just spend all this time hating it.
It's one of those things
Absolutely.
like with any aspect of what, was once hipster culture or whatever. It's never cool. It's always cool to pretend something's over. It's always it's I don't know, I'm not even saying this is a bad thing. It's just the way that these things work. It's always cool to act like you're a little bit above everything. But the
Right.
reality is people you hear a lot about Dime Square being dead, and I think it's morphing, changing. I'm not like Sean Monahan with like my finger on the pulse of exactly what it is necessarily, but I do think it's changing and morphing. But the point is, no matter what aspects of it are a little overplayed now, people are still showing up for these parties in New York as well as in LA. And
Mhm.
seemingly showing up maybe more than ever before. So in that sense, it's actually quite healthy. I mean, it's not as cool as it was in 2021, but there's probably more actual people. So go figure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny too, because like I sort of regret not being there for a lot of that, sort of 2021 stuff.
Hmm.
But like I have a propensity for partying, so it's probably good that I wasn't, because I just sort of keep myself away from that stuff.
Get swept away.
Um,
Sure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
yeah.
Now tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth here. I don't think I am. The what it seems like you discovered in, the dime square scene, the dissident right scene, whatever, is a an element of freedom of thought that is not present as much in the mainstream publishing industry. And that just it seemed, from the way you described it, to have, proved to you to be really refreshing. And I think that's part of what draws everybody to Dime Square, or, this, quote unquote scene more generally, be it people who are, actual liberals, people who are actual monarchists, if we can say that, people who are, everything in between. The idea of like being in an environment where you can once again speak your mind and not be castigated too much. I think that that's a real driving force of this scene. And is that does that map onto what you experienced?
It is. I think, I mean, certainly like I remember doing magazine stuff. I started this stuff pretty young. Like not I was never like a young star of writing or anything. But like I started doing magazine pieces like when I was in my early 20s, which is
Mm.
probably younger than most people.
Yeah.
And
Definitely now, especially. Yeah.
well, younger than most people who aren't rich. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I did a couple of Harper's cover stories like around the time I turned 30.
Mm.
And I remember just like this experience of having your brain break because you're like trying to talk about stuff. Like I did this one piece about it's not the best piece I've ever written, honestly. But I did a Harper's cover story about going to Wisconsin and writing about why this one county, industrial former Union County, Kenosha, went for Trump. And like it broke my brain trying to just say stuff that was like pretty normal, like that felt pretty normal to me. Like these people do not feel like the story of America is going back to what I said before. The story of America's progress. These people do not feel like this thing is working, and like they don't feel like life is better today than it was in 1970. And like even just like to say that, like that piece came out as COVID was like becoming a thing. Like it came out, I forget the dates, but you know, early 2020 or whatever it was. And I remember just like breaking my brain against the wall of trying to like describe politics as I actually saw them. And then 2022, when I wrote that Vanity Fair piece, it was like suddenly you could sort of explain water to the fish. Like you could sort of say, like, we live in a thing, like there's an ideology around you and it's shaping you, and you don't, this isn't the only way. You know, I talk sort of like a policy guy now, because in a certain way, like to be cool now is to actually be able to describe this empire, is to describe like how this system works and like why it works, and like why the ideological structures that we use through that like sort of really boring end of history, everything is just like a corporate, you know, like everything is just going to be commercialized and corporate, and like you have no choice about it. Like to really talk about how and why that works became really difficult in any kind of mainstream space, like even the novel. And so like you noticed that like novels just stopped being cool, in part because like the space that they had to work in was really narrow. And like I have a you know, and having come up in this world, like I have a lot of friends who are like pretty, you know, like pretty well-known American fiction writers or nonfiction writers or whatever. And like you would see them like working in this space and publishing these novels that just like didn't feel like they had any energy, because they weren't explaining like the deep stuff that shapes a mind and a life and a society. They weren't ambitious, because the level of ambition that you had, the level of ambition that like a Norman Mailer or a Norman Rush or somebody who's like bringing to the novel the project of being like, this is what's wrong with life. Like actually you couldn't do. And so you had to be like, well, what's wrong with life is like this group is treated wrong, or like this guy like can't, you know, this guy treats women badly, right? And like some of those books were good. Like the I don't know if you guys read like The Many Loves of Nathaniel P. But like there were like
I've
really
heard of that,
cool scene books that came out that were like pretty good. But like the energy to doing that, the energy to doing like men are bad and like men actually treat women bad, like that's interesting. That was true. I knew a lot of men on the Shitty Media Men list, and some of them deserve to be there. You know, not all of them, but some of them. And like you felt that, and there was energy behind that, and there was an edge to describing that at the moment where like it needed to be described a little bit. But that faded away very quickly, and there was just like a husk left. And so like, you know, when you talk about cool and like what this scene is doing or whatever, I talked about this a little bit on the Good Old Boys podcast, so apologize to anybody who listened to that before, but the death of American writing as a cool and vital form goes back a really long time. It didn't just start with people being woke. It started with the MFA system. It started with literally, you know, people in the employ of the American government encouraging a form of fictional writing at, you know, the University of Iowa that was, you know, narrative first. You know, they wanted these people to not be this kind of like European mode of radical, you know, quasi-revolutionary, like attacker of the society at large. They wanted people to just write story. It was all going to be story. Story is all that matters. It's the interpersonal. It's the narrative. It's the personal story. And like the more you're bringing in this kind of like world building, world narrative, you know, this rangy thing that used to be a novel, the more you're doing that, the more you're this is what they taught you. The
Yeah.
less you're practicing the craft of fiction, the less you're practicing the craft of story. And
Yeah.
story is all it's about, you know? And like, I say that because you start seeing in this new stuff, you start seeing in some of these scenes like stuff that's really not about story. It's about worldview. It's about
Yeah.
you know, and I candidly not a big reader of fiction anymore, partly because it just got so boring. But like when I come across some of these stories now, like you just like I'll happen across a piece in The Point or something, like which is
Mm.
not a based magazine, but it sort of plays in between these spaces a little bit.
Mhm.
And I'm just interested in the fiction again.
Yeah.
And like we can talk about, you know, the big news of Twitter of the last 24 hours, people hating on Honor Levy. And they're like, what is this? This is crazy. Like, this doesn't even have a plot. Like, this is just her showing off. Well, okay, sure. But like, that's what fiction used to be. That's
Mm.
what that
Yeah.
the project of being a novelist for a long time was. I'm not telling you anything about what happened. I'm letting you sit in my mind and imbibe a worldview. And I'm trusting that I'm interesting enough to have you spend time inside my mind and with my worldview, you know? And I haven't read
Absolutely.
O'Connor's book, but like, I think that's a completely justifiable project. And I think there's a reason why people like those stories. And there's a reason why people like Honor as a figure. And that's a big part of being a writer is like, I'm a figure you want to come and spend time with. And that's something that
Yeah.
people in this cooler space are actually willing to imbibe. Um, and if I may just keep going for a
Oh
second
yeah,
here,
absolutely.
Absolutely. This is very
like
interesting. Yeah.
to connect back to like the scene I came up in. If you talked about that, if you talked the way that Honor talks, like she talks, I want to be the voice of my generation. She talks like I want to cultivate myself as a figure. You know, she says this stuff. She's loose. She's fast and loose. She says stuff that'll piss people off. She says stuff that'll make you think like this girl is full of herself. But that up until around the time that Gawker came out, the
Mm.
time that Twitter came out, the time that it became possible for people who were jealous, bitter, and not necessarily good enough to do it themselves to come and hate and police and say, hey, this guy sucks. Hey, this guy's full of himself, all of this stuff. The minute that that started to be the way we talked about literature, you lost those figures. And so,
Absolutely.
you know, and I'm not one of these people who like idolizes the greats of the 70s, right? People always think I'm trying to imitate Hunter Thompson. I'm honestly not. I just happen to share some habits with him. But but like you couldn't during in the world that in the scene that I came up in, you couldn't have had a Hunter Thompson. You couldn't have had a Norman
Mm.
Mailer.
Right.
You couldn't have had any of these people because everybody would have been freaking tearing you down. It would have been vicious. So you learn to stay in a shell. You learn to stay scared, self-protective, hide your worldview. To use these, if people ask like, oh, why is metafiction or autofiction? Why is autofiction always these short sentences, all these short cut off, like sort of like little snippets? Why doesn't anybody write anymore? Well, they don't write anymore because there's just a class of like really bitter, nasty people who have the ability to really like bring people down. And that was a
Yeah.
big part of that culture. And what's cool about Dime Square, again, as an outsider, so people call me lame and old and I don't know the scene and blah, blah, blah. Maybe that's probably true. But from the outside, what's cool is that you see people actually engaged in that artistic project, that broader project of building themselves as a figure, building themselves as a worldview. Like giving you a chance to imbibe themselves as more than just I wrote a story, more
Yeah.
than just craftsman, but an actual person who's trying to do and live and imbibe art.
Absolutely. In our last episode, with a little shout out here to a friend of the pod, Adam Reinspecs, he recently wrote a novel called Mixtape Hyperborea, which has been
Oh, I
well
heard about that.
received.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was reviewed by Mars Review by Ross Barkan, along with Incel by ARX on. Both good novels. Both guys are friends of the pod. But in our last episode with Adam, we discussed how in the writing process how it's important for the writer to though you in some respects have an audience in mind, that, writing is ultimately, in its best form is arguable, but it's for yourself. You write for yourself. You write with yourself as, the imagined reader, and you should be able to kind of write and entertain yourself with your own writing as a kind of iterative process where you write something, and it's a kind of communion with your own sensibility, your own, and that in and of itself will produce a work that is authentic, because you're not worried about catering to the tastes or the needs of a specific group of people or a specific critic. And ultimately, that produces, I think, writing that is more, authentic, thus fearless, thus, much more engaging and, ultimately valuable and insightful. And I think one of the issues that we're running across that you've just described is that we're in a more fearful culture where people are writing to satisfy critics, writing to satisfy social circles, writing to not get canceled or whatever. And as a result, the stories themselves, they don't have the vitality of writing that is done, when those things are not considerations. And yeah, I think, the best writing has always been, to some extent, not obviously without a thought for who would read it, but, primarily an act of, individual devotion to, your own, art, your own muse. And that, I think, is, unfortunately, when we think of the kind of like stultified MFA culture, I think, writing novels have become, and at least mainstream novels, something that is, like a product, but not in a good way, not in a like, like writing a thriller that will be like consumed and like enjoyed, but an artistic product. And that should be a kind of like an anathema idea, like, where we're creating an artistic consumable item.
Hmm.
Yeah. I so like you say that, and it's not that I don't agree with that take. It's that it's just completely alien to my entire experience of doing this work. And like I don't say that as a good thing. I just the in the era that I came up in, and like I've even like tweeted things occasionally. Not, I mean, anyone who goes and looks at my profile after this will see that compared to a lot of people who do the stuff that I do, I don't have a huge Twitter following or something. And I'm not super active on it. But like I will occasionally like get on there and defend the New York scene or something.
Yeah.
This is a super long answer to what you're gonna say.
Oh yeah.
It's gonna connect to.
Yeah.
I'll occasionally get on there and defend the New York scene, because you see these people who are like, oh, it's all this like friend group, this in group, it's this, all these people know each other, everybody's like sort of talking to each other. Well, yeah, bro, like it's supposed to be that. Literature is a collaborative project. It always has been. There isn't
Yeah.
that thing of like that thing of like the guy, and I know some of these people. There are guys out there who wrote in a cabin, who are like freaking plumbers, who one day are like, I have a talent for the short story. And at 52, they put out, I forget his name, but there's a guy from sort of like near where I grew up who wrote this book called Knock 'em Stiff. He's like
Hmm.
55-year-old, like just, I don't know, like former drunk who wrote a collection of short stories, and people really like it. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right, whatever. Leaving that aside, literature is a conversation, and like you are participating in a conversation, and you are speaking to people who are well read in general. Like the way that the way that a book becomes a major book is that it becomes the next thing. It becomes the next thing that like people have seen one form of art, one part of a conversation, and they see somebody come along and do something new and exciting and that's different. And like in order to do that well, you have to be reading other people. You have to be in a conversation with other people. And the way that your work often gets better is by having other people reading it, dissecting it, like not liking it, hearing what the conversations are behind the work rather than just reading it. Like that stuff happens in a scene and nobody gets weird. Like, no, actually they do. Like every scene has this. Like if you go to Nashville, like every like kind of cool alt country guys, like, man, Nashville sucks. Everybody's down on each other. Like everybody's bringing it down corporate, blah, blah. Yeah, but you still moved to Nashville for a reason. You still, if you want to do film, you still move to LA for a reason. You still like these are collaborative, participatory disciplines, right? So that part's always been true, and I think a little bit like we forget that and talk about the New York scene as though it's some kind of like evil thing that shouldn't exist, and that's just ridiculous. It would be impossible to produce literature without it. The thing that happened, I would say, in the early 2010s, like again, not to pin the blame on Gawker because something else would have happened. It's not, this is not a Gawker problem, but the technology, several things happened to change that fundamental dynamic and push it towards a point where it got really bad. One of them was the technology of Gawker, little microblogs, Twitter especially, where like suddenly you had this ability to kind of like snipe and create fear and like make everybody sort of like worried about like the littlest comments and the mocking and stuff like that. Stuff you wouldn't have heard before. That they would have said, you would have said it at the bar, but you would have said straight to somebody's face like, hey, I love the novel. I love the novel. And then like you would go talk to your friend and be like, that guy's so full of himself, right? And those things exist, those things coexist. That's always like, you know, you love Norman Mailer, but he sucks. You know, like you love Norman Mailer, but he sucks to have to listen to, and he gets drunk and he bloviates, right? Those two things can happen in tandem. But
100%,
suddenly with the internet, it became like, if that guy bloviates and he sucks, you sort of forget the good stuff. Because that's what people, that's what drives the engagement. That's what drives the real like vision of everything, right?
The drama, the gossip.
And like it makes people so freaking happy to talk about the bad stuff, right? And nobody jumps in and says, yeah, but like, part of that like helps him, you know, have the confidence to do these big long novels that people like, blah blah. So like that already, like you couldn't have Armies of the Night written today because like the kind of self-mythologizing project that went into writing this arguably, you know, top 5 greatest works of American nonfiction ever, I think would have just been impossible just because that's sniping. Then you had this other thing, which was the kind of like evil pyramid scheme writer production system that developed and that really kicked into high gear in the sort of like 2010s. So you had like, you know, a pyramid scheme of MFA systems where people who were already established got paid by teaching people who were not established, and universities were just opening MFAs and journalism programs, more so MFAs, like right and left, because they generated money for universities that, you know, otherwise would no longer have like English lit departments because nobody did that. People want to be writers. They don't want to study literature. And you were having people come in, debt finance their educations, and then emerge into this world where like there was no place for them. There was nothing for them to do. There weren't enough outlets. The industry was collapsing, and you were pumping tons and tons and tons of kids out into the world saying, you can be a writer. It's going to be hard, but like, we'll give you the tools. They didn't give them the tools. And they financed a lot of people who were pretty good, who got scholarships, who got to go for free. And they financed the professors who just like every parasitic older, like late Gen X boomer who's just like managed to extract wealth, money, and prestige from like the youth. They just sucked money out of these kids and lied to them and said like, oh yeah, we're going to help you. Come to my University of the you know, Central Texas Plains Tech, and we're going to give you an MFA and you're going to go off and be a writer. Bro, it's not going to happen, right? And like they're just, anybody who's like feeding kids that, like, I do a lot of talks and, you know, visit classes and stuff, and every question at the end, it's not like, oh, what is this way that you do your craft? It's, what are my chances of making it? And you're like, I gotta be honest, man. Like, I, I would think about doing a double major here. Like, and these are grad students, right? Um, so then you pumped all that in, right?
Mm,
And that created a really, really, and you guys, I'm sure, have noticed this really kind of like bitter,
yeah.
sniping population that fed into the technological tools. So you gave the tools, and then you gave the population of people who were just like mad, who felt like if only they were the ones getting the chance, then like their writing would be doing good. But it's just like it's unfair because this scene, like it's only those people who go to those bars and know the right people who get to write. And candidly, that's kind of true
Yeah.
because the people who go to those bars and were going and meeting people were the people who were willing to give up their lives, give up the everything else that they had and like move to New York and like try to make this thing the thing that they did. And like that that's kind of like again like my defense of this scene, like sometimes that's what you got to do. Like that
Yeah.
sometimes that's like part of the job is actually like you don't get to stay in your hometown. You don't get to just live in Chicago or Milwaukee and not pay a ton of rent and like have your life be easy and like make a middle class income and be a writer. Because sometimes it's just you have to give stuff up. And that's sort of like part of this scene too. I forget what was the original question here. Um
God, I mean, I'm not 100% sure right now, but I mean, I
but
think we're in an interesting direction here, especially with regard to MFA programs, the overproduction of writers who, all believe that, I mean, like number one, obviously there always was a limited number of people who could be successful writers of any stripe, be it nonfiction or fiction, but especially and this is, part of the notes, pre-episode notes that, after the Great Recession, I mean, I think we both, and so I'm 38, so similar age to you. I grew up reading Esquire, reading Tom Joad, reading,
mhm,
these kind of great, literary nonfiction writers and wanting to be one. And I did, I had some internships in college. But then like the Great Recession hit, the floor fell out. And yeah, it became, obviously very difficult to, make a living as a certainly as a journalist if you want to do real writing. But even as a
mhm,
journalist, if you're writing listicles, it just became very difficult.
mhm,
So you have this class of people who have signed up for okay in the good MFA programs you're totally comped, but like I mean you obviously have a lot of MFA programs where people are 100 in the hole coming out of it or
mhm,
more.
mhm,
And frankly a writer and a writer's life, it's never almost never going to be so remunerative that you can climb out of that. And yeah, so they've kind of, I co-sign entirely on what you said. They've created a class of people who, were sold, especially post Great Recession, this idea that you're going to be a writer and you're going to have this lifestyle that only existed in the past. And the past is that doesn't exist anymore. That's why it's the past. So
mhm.
you have these, very frustrated people. And to, add a kind of, I hesitate to call it a culture war spin, but I at my alma mater, there's a creative writing professor I liked. I don't have an MFA, but I did take creative writing in undergrad, and I, stayed in touch with this guy. And, when I was pitching Nutcranker, I was, asking people about it. And he cautioned me about, the difficulty of finding an agent. And he said that many of his students who match my demographic, straight male,
Hmm.
what have you, They couldn't find agents because
Mhm.
our stories are not the flavor of the month.
Mhm.
And that was, to me it was a little, not it was upsetting, but I cannot imagine the level of upset that one would have if he had paid $100,000 and then realized that the industry has, for politically correct reasons or what have you, decided your stories aren't the right flavor for us right now.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, I think like the situation among MFA graduates, among the writer community in the publishing industry proper is such that it's very bad, and it creates, I think, a tremendous, as we were talking about earlier, opportunity for people from outside the mainstream to both grab eyes on their writing, grab acclaim, but also pull over a lot of former, like, quote unquote normies who say, okay, well, I'm not appreciated here. I'll go where people you won't have me to kick around anymore. And they show up to
Hmm.
a dime square party.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Matt, were you going to say something?
No, no, not really. I'm just going to co-sign what Dan's saying, that is very much the phenomenon you hear about, like elite overproduction, MFA overproduction, and you get scenes like Dime Square. I think it's a huge part of why it exists, in addition to all the political things people talk about. But go on.
Well, so yeah, I mean, this is fun to talk about. This is stuff that I think about a lot, and that I'm
Mm.
often sort of like my girlfriend, who's maybe far more knowledgeable about this stuff than I am, and far more inside the upper echelons of publishing than I am. She always laughs at me for talking about this because it's sort of, to her, it's like a little gauche, like it's a little like, ugh, well, who cares about it? Just do the work. And you're like to me, like I had to think through this stuff like on a really like almost obsessive level, just to even like get where I am.
Yeah.
And I had to plot. Am I allowed to curse on here?
Oh,
Yeah, of
Okay,
absolutely.
course.
there's
Yeah.
okay. I had to plot my fucking shit, bro, like from day one. Like
Yeah.
I was like, and I'm not even like, knock wood, inshallah, like someday that I'll end up being something like a canonical writer, but like for like how much I've put into this and like how much work it has been and like how little I've even like been able to produce, like compared to like the psychic energy and just like literal
Yes.
like
Yes.
insanity I've had to put into it, like I sometimes I just look around and I'm fucking embarrassed. Okay, but
Mm.
like I can give a kind of reason, or I can give my personal story of why that is, and because it connects exactly what you're talking about.
Mm.
So I came up like at a time when I was really, really fucking bait and switched, like really badly. And it's not
Yes.
anybody's fault. I'm not bitter about it, but boy, did I get fucked. Because and a lot of us at our age did. And I'm not going to name any names here, but there's a couple stories of people who you would well know from Twitter, who have almost
Mm.
the exact same story. So I was like I wrote a couple like really successful for like a young kid, like books pieces, like savage takedown pieces. Like I wrote a
Mm.
piece about this guy, John Jeremiah Sullivan, who at the time when I was coming up was the king.
Mm.
He was the of American literary nonfiction. He wrote this book first. Nobody reads it anymore, but he wrote first this book called Blood Horses that came out of a Harper's
Huh.
article. And at the time, Harper's was just like this perfect medium between newsy and literary. And they had these literary craftsmen. I came up under this guy, Ben Metcalf, who's been, you
Mm.
know, absolutely disappeared from this world. Like, just like a guy like him can't exist anymore. But like people who are obsessed on a sentence level, like with the beauty of writing. And he
Mhm.
would write on pieces of paper, like 50 different versions of like those punny heads that Harper's had.
Mm.
Like, I remember I worked on one piece about a guy who did concealed carry for a month, and it took like 50 different guesses, but finally they came up with the head for that piece, and it was happiness is a worn gun, and it's like bam, got it.
That's
It's
good.
amazing. and they would work
Yeah.
like psychopaths to get to that point. Like this is a real production of literature, right?
Yeah.
And at that time, you had people like John Sullivan, who wrote Pulphead. Everyone should read it, but read Blood Horses because that's even better. That was real art. Like that was real reported art. You had people like Wells Tower, who was doing amazing long form
I remember
reporting.
him.
You had J.D. Daniels, you had William T. Vollman.
Sure.
I'm trying to think of all the greats, but this was this like moment. The guy I came up kind of learning from was this man who's largely forgotten because he never had a book out, named Matthew Power, who was a great adventure journalist and died in Uganda at 39. Like he died of a heart attack reporting for Men's Journal. But he was just this long form magazine guy. And so you had all these people doing like really great, like nonfiction that aspired to the level of art, who were, white guys who liked adventure and literature and came from that 70s tradition of, Tom McGain and James Crumley and all, Charles Willeford and all these like dirty American, like I touch America, but I'm also literary. They were the children of that, right? And they were doing that at a pretty high level, and they were doing it in glossies. They're doing it in fucking GQ, right? And then I start to do this. I start coming up under these people. And I had dropped out of college and rode freight trains. And then I lived in Africa and I worked for a logistics company, or I worked doing logistics like in the Sahara and like had all these adventures. And I wrote about that. And I had been sort of trained and mentored by the people at N+1. And sometime around 2014, I wrote a memoir, 2015, wrote a memoir about train hopping. That was about 15,000 words. And the guy who I had worked with at N+1, who had kind of brought me in and convinced me to become a writer because he had heard these stories and stuff, he was like, this is great. My agent was like super, super into it. Like everybody's like, wow. And then we're going to do this in N+1 and it's going to be a big thing. And then in the same way that Anna Wiener, several years later, wrote a thing about going and working in tech and then, sold a book for, I won't say how much, but for a lot of money. And, it made her as a writer. She became one of the biggest bestsellers. And it was literary nonfiction based on a little N+1 memoir. And that's how people did it. There's so many big American books that came out of like one really good quasi-personal, quasi-reported piece, right? That was the path. And that piece, like, they told me it was going to run. And then it just kind of like disappeared. And like I knew enough. I knew those people. I knew everybody in the magazine. This wasn't like I was some outsider being confused. I knew exactly what was happening. And they were like, yo, we're not publishing this white boy memoir. This is just not what we do anymore. And it was right when, and I'm not complaining about this. It hurt me very much. Obviously, it was a big thing, but like I understood that this was where the system was going. So this is not like some individual fucked me, right? But like I could see the direction where things were headed. And candidly, people at N+1 could see the direction where things were headed. And so the top guys, the people who were made famous in this like sort of Gawker moment as these figures of New York, Keith Gesson, Mark Wright, Marco Roth, Ben Kunkel, all these, you notice they all pulled back. They all pulled back and they handed the magazine over to Dana Tortorici, who is very smart and who I consider a friend, I guess. I mean, I haven't talked to her in years. But, you could sense that the magazine under Dana, arguably America's sort of like big feminist coordinator of like America's like left-wing feminist thing, was just not going to be a place for me anymore. And I was lost because I had worked so hard on that thing. I had based my career on this thing. I was like, I am going to be the male freaking like Elena Ferrante, like, because I write in this super, super personal way. My agent used to joke that she only represented like economists and crazy girls. And I was like, well, which one am I? And she was like, you're a crazy girl. And that was I was a personal writer, like to have, doing that. And I just watched that die in front of me. And like my mentor at N+1, like just didn't talk to me for years because he had promised a lot of stuff and then just like he couldn't make it happen, and he just
Yeah.
avoided me. It was like 5 years. I saw him at a party, and I was like, "Sit down, we gotta talk." And we kind of hashed it out, but I actually understood what had happened. I saw it coming, and this was
Yeah.
pre Me Too. This was not about any of that stuff, but it was the building up of that. It was
No, I
Yeah.
remember. Yeah, I'm younger than. I mean, you guys are about the same age. I'm younger, but yeah, I was in college 2013. I talk about this all the time on the pod. Like, everyone remembers Me Too and Trump, but it was 2013, 2014 when boom, you started seeing the
Yeah.
pushback. Yeah, go on.
And in New York at the time, man, like I was, trust me, I mean, if there is any proof that I'm at heart a nice Midwestern boy, like I was single in New York from the years like 2013, 14 through 2017, working in media as a 28-year-old, like, and never got in trouble. So boy, but like it was, and again, like before, even before Me Too, like you would just go on dates and think like, I just gotta get out of here because this is just the energy's bad. Like this is gonna redound badly on me. Like the
Yeah.
rumors, there's something. It just felt like this terror zone, And again, I'm
Oh,
not even complaining.
100%.
And like,
Yeah.
because a lot of dudes were bad, and like the sexual economy of New York is horrible for women. Like it's just not. It's a really unfair thing because like any scoliotic bald freak in New York can just like. No offense to the bald men among us, but I just mean like
I
you
don't
just
have
have these
scoliosis, so I'm not offended.
these guys, just these guys who are like these lecherous freaks, like can just get laid because there's just not that many guys in that industry in that corner of the world, and so you're just like they can be horrible, And there was you could feel this resentment and this anger and this kind of feeling like that I'm never going to be able to like settle down. None of these guys are ever going to do it. So this is all built. This is all part of the project of literature in a certain way because you need these people. You can't just
Yeah.
magically write. Honor Levy is a good example. You can't just magically write a book of your favorite thoughts and have it be good. Like it doesn't work like that. You have to cultivate readers and you have to cultivate like a worldview that is in conversation with the worldview that maybe you're trying to change and all this boring stuff that
Yes.
goes into blah, blah, blah. So, okay. So I was like, oh man, I'm fucked. And I didn't have the language to describe what that looked like. I wasn't like, oh, the wokesters are killing me.
Mm.
I just knew that like there was no place left for me in this thing. And that like if I
Yeah.
wanted to do a novel, this was not going to be the time. And like I would sit there and try to work on it, but like trying to figure out like how to make this thing I was trying to describe be something that could work in this environment. I was just like, this sucks. This isn't possible. And so the reason I'm saying this is that there are people on the dissident right who are very good writers who came up again in this world, who worked in and around these magazines, who knew these people, who turned in a direction I didn't even know you could turn in. And that is kind of why that's maybe why I'm not like ultra based now, is I just didn't even know that was a thing. And so I wasn't on Twitter either. So like I didn't even know I didn't know any of these people, right? I'd never heard of BAP. And so I
Yeah.
was just like, I'm just gonna go do something where they can't get me in trouble. So if I'm reporting and having adventures in the West, then like I can kind of do a thing that fits me, fits how I live,
Yeah.
fits my stuff, my candidly maleness. I can do that, and nobody's going to get mad at me because you got to do that if you're reporting on the West, or like if you're
Yeah.
going to Africa, or you're doing war reporting, whatever. So you solve the problem, and you can hide your worldview. You can hide in journalism, and like I'm not necessarily proud of that, but that was my solution rather than being like, oh fuck this system, the women have taken it over and ruined everything. Like I'm just gonna hide for a while. And then like the Vanity Fair piece for me was like the sort of coming back out where it's like, okay, cool. Like I'm gonna like try something. I'm gonna push the limits a little bit. Like I'm gonna come
Yeah.
back into politics, blah, blah, blah. Right. And this is a long way of saying that like one thing I actually probably would say sometimes to people who are in the more like outsidery, you could call it dime square thing, base thing, whatever, is like I actually think that like that moment is just not as much of a thing as people think it is now. Like I think like there are people who made a hard turn and are like, I'm not a part of this. I hate this. I'm going to go to war with this. And I understand that, completely understand that. I think if you didn't do that, you actually could have just waited 3 years and come back in and you'd be fine.
Mm.
And like I think you see that with Honor. Somebody texted me just now. I'm fairly sure I don't know who edited Honor Levy's book, and I'm just using her as example. Sorry to
Yeah.
keep bringing
Sure.
her up. I don't know who edited Honor Levy's book, but I have a pretty good idea.
Mm.
And somebody texted me recently, like, how is it Honor Levy is getting a Nick Land reference into Penguin Press? And it's like,
Huh.
because the person who I think her editor is like, honors age and like interesting and reads stuff and knows that this isn't like evil and like knows that this is the stuff that people talk about on the internet and that if they're going to be vital, they have to publish it. And that's Penguin. That's main Penguin. That's the main imprint.
Yeah.
I'm not going to, I mean, that is like, and Godoff, Godoff.
Mm.
Whatever. One of the most powerful. I mean, this is
Yeah.
somebody who like edits Dick Cheney. This is somebody who edits
Okay.
like. I mean, these are people who that's not who. I'm sure that's not who's editing Honor's book, but that's the person who's overseeing that imprint. Like these are people at a very very high level.
Yeah.
And I met with Penguin on my next book, and um it was fine. I mean, there was no questions about like politics. There's no questions about like whether I was too Utrecht. So I do think some of this stuff is changing. And like
I get that
Interesting.
sense too. Yeah.
I'm friends with tacos. And I don't know how that would work, honestly. I don't know if I don't know how the shift over into mainstream publishing or something would work for tacos and like with the stories and stuff, but I'm also not convinced it would be impossible.
Oh yeah. No, me
Yeah.
neither. If they can publish Honor, I think they're well on their way. Not that I've
Mhm.
read her book yet, but yeah, as you said, if you can get a Nick Land reference in there, I think we reached a critical mass. I mean, I have been I've talked about this recently too. I've been sort of on the online right for not as long as many people, but a little while, like 2017, 2018. And there was a real fear, like you say one thing, you name one person, you're going to be lumped in with Charlottesville. And this, the degree to which
Mhm.
that has changed, and I'm not saying this, it's not like it really is that, and now we've insidiously fooled everyone. Like, no, just as you said with the Nick Land thing, like there's an understanding that people are going to talk about Nick Land, Curtis Yarvin, BAP online, not necessarily agree with everything, but these ideas are here, and I think there's even an implicit understanding that they're here for a reason. They're here because
Mm.
something was undersold. So even if some of these people say things that would still horrify a lot of people at Penguin or at the New York Times, yeah, I don't want to be too optimistic, but I think there's something in the water. There's an understanding that, the best place to explore these ideas is in broad daylight rather than it being occulted online.
Mhm.
I don't know. You're a lot closer to it than me and have a lot more experience with it than me, but I no longer fear sort of cancellation in that way because
Mm.
all of these ideas are so mainstream in a weird way now.
Yeah, and I think like there's just this sort of uh I don't know. I used to think that there was like a fear of like being friends with people. Like that even just like saying a certain person could get you like sort of totally like just
Mm.
like memory hold. Um and now again, I don't want to say names or whatever because now we just get people in trouble or I'm going to prove that I'm wrong by getting somebody in trouble by saying this. But like there are people who have won Pulitzer Prizes, literally people who are Pulitzer Prize winners, who are just like, friends with some of the most like based crazies that you got
Hmm.
out there, and like
Mm.
there's just nobody cares. Like nobody, it's too much to follow, and like there's too much like it's so hard to like pick out a detail like that now and get traction from it. Like, and there isn't actually a Gawker. There isn't like that kind of you can do it on Twitter. Like people will say stuff about me on Twitter, and I'm like, I don't really care because like I'm not really like, I don't have a politics that fits into a left-right thing anyway. So it's like, you're not going to
Mm.
get me for being right wing or something. It's not, I'm not worried about it. But like, you'll see people like try to engineer this little thing like James Pogue, we know what you're up to. I know what you've been doing. I know who you hang out with, you know? And it's like, I used to get worried about that stuff. Like, oh my God, like this is going to be a thread. And it's like, okay, do a thread. Like, it's going to get 2 retweets from just like people, you know, there's just like, it doesn't even come across anymore. Like no one cares
Yeah.
enough about me. And I guess what I meant about the Gawker thing is there's nothing to give that imprimatur. Like even when they did like the new Gawker, like they tried to do this thing. I remember this because I was there. This is sort of like funny detail of like proof of concept. When like new Gawker was launched by Leah Finnegan,
Mm.
um, it was trying to do this thing of like enforcing cool using essentially like young, underpaid, highly elite. Like if you notice like all the bylines, like they're all people who like went to Princeton. And
Mm.
like Leah Finnegan is like this very, I mean, I don't want to talk, whatever. Don't get me into that. But like, you know, these are people who have like a very, very like high connection to like high elite Ivy League society, right?
Mm.
And then they were doing the Gawker thing of like, ah, bam, like we got them. This person's so lame, they did this thing, and it was the one that kind of like really became the thing that people remembered about that brief reiteration of Gawker was when they did this thing where they like saw on a Thomas Chatterton Williams Instagram story something about Texas or something, and they decided he was at the Alex Jones film premiere in Austin.
Mm.
Yeah.
And he
I
wasn't.
remember that. Yes.
He wasn't. I was. I was there. So I was there actually when there's this big picture that came out that everybody got mad about. There's Glenn Greenwald, Anna Kachian, Amanda Milius, and somebody else. And they're all like, and then it was supposed to be like Thomas Chatterton Williams was there too, and that was like, and it was like Thomas Chatterton Williams with his lame friends goes to lame party, like blah blah blah, and like first of all it was wrong, and second of all it was like you guys are just so visibly lame too that like who do you think you're getting with this? Like what is even the
Yeah.
point? Like this isn't you don't have the energy of like we're outsiders going after the powerful because what you're doing is like you're trying to like get like the anti-woke crowd in trouble or something. And it's just like, who cares? They're not even that powerful. Um,
Yeah.
and so just the
It's
whole project like just sort of like fell apart
Yeah.
because the snark wasn't worth it. Um,
mm.
and so that's my other thing is like I just think that now because of the flood of information, it's just really, really hard to get people in trouble because you have to really like even like Yasha Monk, and I do not know the circumstances of this at all. But there was that brief thing where like Yasha Monk got accused of assaulting somebody, and it like
Mm.
it was just weird. Like it didn't get any traction. Like it didn't,
Mm.
it just sort of like came out, blew up on Twitter a little bit, and then like the balloon just fell back down. And like I I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. Like because I don't know anything about that situation, but like it almost seems like Yasha could just go on and keep doing whatever he's doing, and that like there would have been no consequence to it, even though there was like a very public accusation against him.
Yeah.
So it's just like everything is just this stew of constant information that's become increasingly meaningless.
Yeah. I mean, I think to an extent that is probably, I mean, not to sound callous, but a bit of a good thing because, I mean, the separation of the artist and what he does and who he is personally is an important, in my mind, separation. Certainly, it's something that we apply to artists from the past, but, so too, I think to an extent, even living artists. We should be able to appreciate someone's art without also inquiring as to Oh, are they inappropriate on a date? Are they, or even
Yeah.
worse, are they criminals? Okay, well, I mean, certainly there are criminals who are in prison who have produced art. And, we don't, say like, oh, well, you can't enjoy, you can't read the who was that guy from the 70s, the pimp who wrote the I think it was Ice Pick Slim or something like
Iceberg
that.
Slim, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 So, I mean, like, there has I mean, not to get too based here, but many people have written stuff that they wrote in prison that has, been read widely, and, certainly this kind of school marmish separation of the artist from his output and well, if this person fails to meet this such and such standard, that's to the extent we're moving away from that, I think that's a good thing. And it doesn't mean that you have to co-sign on, the person's behavior.
Right. And I mean, it's not, I brought up that specific example because it's like, it just, if, and not litigating it, I just don't know anything about it. It's just as a matter of interest, like, if what the accusation said was true, then it's a matter for the police, not for me to litigate one way or the other. If it's
Exactly.
not true, then like, why would I have to care about this at all? And like in either case, it's not, in either case, it's just sort of like something that shouldn't be on Twitter. Like it,
Yeah.
because either it's not true and it shouldn't have been brought up at all, or it is true and dude should have to face like actual real investigations and real problems. Like either way, like why was this a public conversation? Like it just doesn't make sense to me. Um, and I do think we're like pretty far past that. And I think there's a certain level of like, like I don't really write about this stuff and I don't really, this isn't part of my like public persona, but I don't, so I'm not trying to like make this my thing or say
Mm.
that I've been cut out of whatever, but like sex is cool and like dudes have sex too. Like and like it's just suddenly like for a while like that was just like a thing that like was impossible to like
Oh
but
yeah.
that's what people when a rapper raps like that he's talking about like how he's good at getting people to have sex with him, and like
Yeah.
there should be to some degree if you want to have male writers who people are like drawn to as figures and like are interested in spending time with in the pages of a book like that person probably should be kind of sexy like otherwise like what are they doing like and like
Yeah.
why are you drawn to them as a guy who you're gonna like spend time with like
Right.
he should be able to attract women right and
Or
like
even if not, I would just add as a caveat, even if not, there still should be something there. Like Welbeck is not an attractive man, but he's got something.
well, that's what I
You know what I
mean.
mean?
But like, I think there are a lot of people who are attracted to him despite him not being
Right.
attractive, right? And
Yeah.
that's part of the thing. Like, that's part of why it works. And like, um, I don't know if you could have an American Welbeck yet, but I kind of think like there's a hunger there. You see that in Dime Square. Like, you could see Dime Square as, or whatever this thing is. Is
Yeah.
Dime Square over? I
Sure.
don't know. Whatever that side of things is.
The
Like
parallel cultural
yeah,
economy.
you could see that as being because every writer who makes it in the world like comes out of having like a sort of like core base of readers that then expands from it most of the time. And like you could see that as being a core base of readers who could, you know, cultivate an American Welbeck. I think that would be completely possible.
Yes.
Um,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think we're kind of getting into in the pre-show notes, I kind of delineated to what extent is the mainstream media industry embracing this sort of vibe shift. I think a little bit, but also we're seeing in as time goes on, your article about Yarvin was 2022. We're 2 years out from that, and we're seeing a sort of professionalization of the parallel cultural economy. So now you have Passage Press, you have Man's World, you have I Am 1776, you have all sorts of different, and I mean certainly like Good Old Boys, the various podcasts have caught steam, a lot of people listening. I mean, what is your sense of is the mainstream to what extent is the mainstream embracing this quote unquote vibe shift? To what extent is this being led by or will be, totally captured by a parallel cultural economy, which will get the gains and the eyes that the mainstream is, going to miss out on because they're afraid of embracing this stuff? Or, alternatively, will Penguin reach out to I don't know, like say Dan Baltic and
Uh,
say, Dan, we want to pay you $500,000 for Nutcracker too.
Um, well, okay, so there's a bunch there. Um, yeah, I mean the parallel stuff, like, one way of thinking about this is like that uh there's always this kind of like quality gap that exists whenever you have like a kind of new ecosystem rise up. Like
Sure.
there's a quality gap that you saw this sort of like with Jacobin maybe like which forget the politics. Everybody just forget the politics. I'm not talking about the
Mm,
politics, but like there was a minute there where Jacobin's getting going, and now like they're very good at producing a magazine. They're very good at sort of
mm,
like the actual just mechanics, the editing, the production, the getting the writers. Like they do it well. It looks good. It feels good. It's just a product that works well. Like whatever you think of the politics. Um, and that takes time. It's probably easier, candidly, on the left, just because there's like a lot more people who do it. So if
mm,
you're just specifically like in the ecosystem of forgetting the main, I don't consider like the New Yorker or the Atlantic like left wing, but like in the
mm.
specific communities of the left, like you have a lot of people who are like radical enough that like they're not really gonna be able to fit consistently into the New Yorker, who are gonna be writing for the New Left Review, for N+1, for Jacobin and
Mm.
stuff like that. And like a lot of those people are very smart and they're very highly educated and they know the mechanics of publishing. They grew up in it. They've
Mm.
imbibed it for years and years and years. And like the right just has less of that. So like there's a couple things going on here where like when you say like parallel institutions that are just like we want to do cool stuff and the mainstream is kind of lame now, so like we're going to try this other stuff. Like that's one thing. And then there's this other thing of like we are the dissident right. We are doing right wing stuff and we are making a project. We want the regime to go away. That to me, those are kind of separate projects, right? Like
Mm.
that, there's, and there are things that bridge it.
Mm.
You can go to Sovereign House and you can meet people who want to just do cool shit, and you can meet people who want to overthrow the regime, and they can have a drink together. But they're kind of not doing the same thing. And like, so like you notice with I Am 1776, like, you notice that it like the quality, the production quality is getting better. Like, and so it was like now it feels like a more consistent project. It feels
Mm.
like people are like getting into the rhythm of like this is how we do it. This is what the product is. These are the mechanics of magazine publishing. Like there's all this like kind of like boring inside baseball that's not artistic that like I came up in because I write for periodicals. So like
Mm.
I'm just like interested in like how well somebody like how well
Yeah.
somebody frames section one, like that, the mechanics of the stuff like that I'm interested in. You can see that getting higher quality. Man's
yeah.
World, like I haven't, I don't read it all the time, but I've obviously like sort of seen it, and you can see like it's printed, it's getting better. It's like it looks like one of these things that you could buy on the shelf of expensive like lifestyle style fashion magazines in the back of the bookstore. There's things that cost $45. It looks like it's getting towards being one of those things that's just a really well produced product.
Yeah.
Um, The thing that I think is going to be trouble, and the thing that, like, if I could argue, like, took Jacobin from being in 2017 like an extremely vital magazine, a magazine that was almost like verging on being mainstream in its level of importance, to being something that I just like don't really read anymore. That was a technological problem, and it came from like the left having a lot of people who were like, this is how being on the left, this is what it means to be on the left, is you think these exact sets of thoughts and you think this stuff. And if you don't think this stuff, we're going to come for you. And so like, you would say like, hey, I have this idea of something. And then there would be like just 600, like literally 600 quote tweets on every piece, just being like, this ain't it, bro. And like, it would be like, cause like you said, it's something like incredibly banal. Right. And like you saw this with Angela Nagel. You saw this with like the people who were driven out of the left. Like that, Angela wrote that piece for American Affairs that Angela, I'm not friends with her. I always call her Angela because I like her work, but I've only talked to her once on the phone. Anyway, Angela Nagel, great writer, who disappeared from the left after she wrote this piece for American Affairs about how, like, titled "The Left Case for Open Borders," and it was just like it was vicious, crazy attacks. You didn't really see much from her ever again. Like that was it. And I would say that the thing that I worry about vis-a-vis just like the quality of these places, that whether or not like I'm personally going to be super right-wing and ultra-based, like are just outlets that produce interesting writing. And frequently pick. I'm interested to read about Eric Prince in 1776. Like I don't even have to co-sign everything it's going to say, but that's cool and interesting, and he's going to talk more freely to them than he is going to talk to the Atlantic. So let's hear it. Let's go. The problem that I notice, and I think anybody who's on Twitter right now and a little bit in these spaces will notice, is that like the same thing that happened to the left is now happening to the right, in terms of like once Elon Twitter got going and everybody was freed up to say whatever they wanted, like all of a sudden you could just be like, yo, this ain't it. So like anything that like didn't fit the right dissident right take, the proper dissident right take. And like, I'm just not really a part of this. So it's not my thing. I don't care that much, but like, notice I'm at least friends and acquaintances with a lot of the sort of like tradish feminist type people, like the people who's in that like weird, and like, notice over and over the last few months, they're just like, yo, like people talk about women terribly now. Like we cannot keep dealing with this. We are leaving. And there was like that weird Lauren Southern thing where Lauren Southern was like, like Lauren Southern of all people, like, and I haven't followed her little like redemption arc or whatever it is, but she's like, the right is driving women away because you guys hate women and you don't, blah, blah, blah. And like, leaving aside whatever that conversation is, the problem that those magazines are going to face is that it's going to be really hard to do interesting work without like the sort of army of like Anons and just sort of like egg icon Twitter people jumping in and being like, this fucking sucks. You guys are lame. Like you're not even based anymore. Like this sucks. Like you go back to what you used to be. Like that's going to happen because it's a technological problem. It's not a problem of ideas. It's if you engineer, as especially the right does, if you engineer your engagement via Twitter, then you are going to have this problem no matter what your publication does. And so I'm not actually that optimistic about the future quality of some of these, unless there can be a way to kind of divorce them from how much Twitter has like taken over this side of things and this sphere of things. I just think it's like a really tough problem to solve, and it's not anybody's fault. But complicated thought does not lend itself well to stuff that has its engagement driven by Twitter. With regard to the other part, the vibe shift, there's a kind of twist to that, because like the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Atlantic, places like that, they actually don't get as much engagement on those pieces from Twitter as you would think. Like if you're on Twitter, you think that like something blew up on there. That's why people read it. in a lot of mainstream media, that's actually not true.
Mm.
And so like you'll see these like huge pylons of a piece or something, like everybody's like, this sucks, or like that doesn't necessarily matter that much to the event. And so if you actually read the stuff they're doing, the vibe shift already happened at the Atlantic. Like
Yeah.
they're not their problem is actually really interesting, and it goes to the heart of like what this actual problem of all of this writing and all of this project really is. The Atlantic is a thing that exists. Their worldview is we agree that America should be a world-straddling commercial empire. We think this is good. We think liberalism is good. We think America basically did it right, and we think it's falling apart. You can notice it. They are putting in stuff that is like, what the hell went wrong with neoliberalism? They put in a lot of stuff. What the hell went wrong with tech? They put in a lot of stuff. What the hell went wrong with woke stuff? They're like really, the New Yorker is not doing this. The New Yorker has not caught up to this, but the Atlantic has sensed that the vibe shifted and that they don't understand why. And like you can see that in their work. Like, and so like I haven't read it yet, but Thomas Chatterton Williams just had a profile of Walter Kern. And like I am assuming it's pretty favorable. And I'm assuming that it was a way for Thomas Chatterton Williams to discuss the critiques of end stage liberalism that have made Walter Kern into the guy that the crotchety critic that he is. Like, and like you certainly could not do that at the Atlantic right now. Or sorry, you couldn't do that at the New Yorker right now. Like that would still be like a step too far. But in the Times, like I have a piece that I'm working on right now about like this is the end of neoliberalism, and actually like it's about a politician who is arguing essentially for working with the JD Vances of the world, because his thing is like, hey, the system has to change. The system has to change very radically. And like for right now, we need a popular front against this one central like death-seeking neoliberalism that shapes the world. We got to build a popular front against that. And then we'll sort out the right left, and we'll sort out like who's right about what the next step is. But like on a high level, on a high like politics shaping the American empire level, like that's what the vibe shift is. It's not like, can you say the R slur like in your article? It's like, are we supposed to keep this empire going? And like that's the process I think we're seeing now. And that's the process that like the IM 1776 is engaged in. They're like, we got to change this empire and do this other thing. And I think it's important to have that conversation. I'm not sure I agree with necessarily with like where they're trying to take it. But yeah, I think it's like very vital to actually have those, because at least there's an outlet that can do stuff. At least there's an outlet that can do stuff that's like high production value, well written, well edited, that actually articulates this worldview, rather than it being just like this scary mob on Twitter that people can point to and say like, that guy said X, so they're all like that. You know, it's much better to have the magazines and have the thought out there.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, it's important to have a magazine that will actually, kind of try to honestly deal with these issues, be an honest broker. Yeah, no, that's very important. Where do we think that Gonzo journalism, to the extent that that is, something that you do, I mean, obviously you've, have many different styles and talents, but where do we think that fits into the future of journalism more broadly? Because we have this environment where, as you discussed on Isaac's pod, there's a dearth of high-paying jobs for writers. Gonzo journalism, by its very nature, you have to, send someone on location. You have to give someone a little, a certain amount of rope to, really write the story. Where does that sit? And I mean, it seems like, given the challenges we've discussed with regard to fiction, I think this to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of the same challenges apply with regard to literary journalism, both financially and culturally. And in the parallel economy, again, it seems like that potentially is an answer here, but as we've just discussed, yeah, I mean, to the extent that you're being led around by the nose by your, kind of commentariat, that's a problem too. So where is the literary fiction writer situated in this future?
Wait, literary fiction or literary nonfiction?
Nonfiction, sorry. Correct.
Um, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's there's an optimistic version of this, which is that like there just aren't that many people who do this thing that I do.
Mm,
And there just aren't that it takes a long time to learn. It's not like being
hmm.
a novelist, really. Like it's not, I mean, maybe it is. Novelists maybe hit their prime at 40, right? But you get a lot of people who kind of like write a really great book at 29. They hit the mode and
Yeah.
they do it, And like this thing is just it's there's phone skills and just like logistics and the mechanics of like, okay, we got to move that section up and down
Yeah.
and stuff like that. And like just knowing when you've spent enough time on reporting a feature, like it just takes a while to learn. And like not that many people are willing to go through that stuff. And so it you end up with like not that
Mm,
many people competing with you, honestly.
Mm.
exactly.
If you just keep doing it for a while. That's been my experience. Part of it, like the money stuff is tough. Like I don't make a ton. If it
Mm.
wasn't for books, I would be broke, basically. Like it's the books that like give you the big check. And like even if I make a pretty good word rate for like Vanity Fair, but like you
Yeah.
just can't do that many of these pieces a year. It's just too much work and it takes too much out of you. And like unfortunately to do this work like where you're just paying yourself a monthly salary by writing pieces, like
Mm.
it's hard to bring the level of reporting and intensity that it would take to do really great reported pieces. And that's why most people who are like nonfiction reporters or whatever, and I'm a little dismissive of this, honestly, but it's like, you're not a fucking reporter, you're a commentator. Like, and
Yeah.
there's just so much commentary out there that's just like, okay, cool, man. Like, but you can do that and you just do a lot of those pieces, you get $700 a pop or whatever, and you're like, keep going, right?
Yeah.
Um, but that's actually a shitty economy. That's actually a shitty economy because it's just
Mm,
race to the bottom, basically. And like it's
mm,
just easy to get commentary. Doing reporting, like the thing that you have to do in the nitty-gritty of it, the thing you have to do is get a couple pieces under your belt, both for your own experience, both you know how to do the work, and so like you can build the cred to keep doing it. And that just like takes startup capital. Like I just blew money, like, and took risks to go report stuff,
Yeah.
so that
sure.
I'd be able to do a couple features, and then like it kind of, you can kind of go from there. If you don't have like really intense connections and a really intense like high level pedigree, and you're trying to break into this, it's really hard. It's really hard to get someone to send you and to get the chops under your belt in order to start doing this work, unless you just do it yourself. You got to pay for it yourself. And like I reported and wrote my entire first book on spec. Like
Yeah.
I just went and I
That seems
blew.
like that's what people have to do. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the way to do it. The trick is that after a while, then it works. And
Mm,
Yeah.
like, and if you can keep that going, just sell a book, lose $10,000 a year for 4 years in a row, and then sell another book and keep doing that. That economy is not that hard. Like, because people buy books still. Like
mm.
the book market still exists. And if you're confident enough in yourself, like, and you really can like bet on yourself, like you can do stuff that other people just aren't going to risk doing. And that's
Yeah.
always sort of been the game of literature. Like you have to believe. I just saw a tweet from Jordan Castro where he was saying like, if you don't wake up in the morning thinking like I'll be the exception to like how
Yeah.
horrible this whole industry is, then you're fucked. You have to believe that you'll be the exception. The trouble is sometimes you're not the exception, and that just sucks.
I find it to be like not that I'm a reporter, but I am a podcaster and I am a writer, of fiction, nonfiction, whatever. And like I haven't made it yet by any means, but I find it is like this game that you play. Living in LA, you hear a lot about positive thinking, and a lot of it's bullshit. But like there is something to that. You almost have to like fake it till you make it. And even if you're hopefully not going into debt, but spending your own money for whatever venture. I know a lot of filmmakers who are, basically finance their own movies. You have to like finance your own thing and act like you don't actually care how well it does, act like you don't actually care if it's going to make money or not. Well, when in reality, of course, you do. And if you can project that confident energy, then people will
Yeah.
be like, oh, this guy would be worth paying. Like you have to not be that serious about money in this weird way in order to make it seemingly.
And part of the thing, like part of the stuff that's just difficult about this and like that does make being a part of a scene so important is
Yeah.
that the more you understand the industry, like this is the interplay between art and like trying to do important work and just like the nitty-gritty. The more you understand the mechanics of the industry, the more you can make informed, good, risky bets. Because you're like, this is gonna fucking like I can go and look at a story like, I mean, now I can do it really easily. But even at like 28, I had like a pretty decent idea, like, oh, this Bundy thing is going to be a big story and it's the right story for me and I'm going to make this money back. So I can just drop a few grand or even put it on a credit card. Not a great idea, but you can do it. And just like you can kind of know enough about the mechanics that like the risk is going to be worth you doing
Yeah.
that, like you going for it. And like for my second book, which I sold recently, on proposal, not I haven't written the draft
Yeah.
yet, or I had part of it, but for that book, like I went $40,000 into credit card debt because because I had a bunch of crypto and it had all gone down. I didn't want to sell it, and I was like, I'm pretty sure this book is gonna work, but like I need a few months to get all this stuff in order and blah blah blah. And I just maxed out card after card after card after card. And I honestly wasn't that worried about it because I was like, I understand how this proposal is coming together. I understand the market. I understand sort of like where I fit into it. And like it's going to take some time, but this is going to work out. And then, okay, bam, I paid him off. But if I wasn't involved in this kind of like nitty gritty,
Yeah.
ugly side of the scene thing, I wouldn't have been able to take a risk on trying to do a piece of like non-fictional art that I felt like would eventually sell because it would have been insane to take that risk, not knowing the business,
Yeah, and
And
that's
so,
I think that's another element where I have this a bit with the film industry. Like you work. I mean, your story's a bit different than mine, obviously. But actually like working within publishing in the more traditional way that you did. In some ways, it was probably draining and to a certain extent. But even like what you're describing earlier with the bait and switch, going through all that now informs your ability to be a more self-starter now, wouldn't you say?
yeah. And like, it informs me like it can't get any harder for me than it was to be a more or less unknown mid-20s guy at in the middle of the 2010s. Like
Yeah.
like it can't get any harder. And so like now it's not like things are easy. It's not like it's just like, oh, this is fun. Like I'm gonna get off this podcast and go work on a draft that it's gonna make me want to like jump off a cliff. But
Uh,
like it it just there's no way that like doing this kind of work and like trying to do something like interesting and like maybe a little risky could get any worse than it was in the early and mid 2010s when like publishing was fucking collapsing, when the luxury ad market had disappeared and so magazines were dying left and right, like when people thought that like BuzzFeed listicles was like the only thing that people are going to read in all of the future. Like a lot of that stuff's been solved. Like a printed book
Mm,
is still the best technology for delivering complex thought. Like
mm,
there's just like that's just not going to go away because that's what people need in order to like learn stuff in the world. Like
mm.
there's a lot of people who are going to learn stuff from Joe Rogan. That's cool too, but like this conversation about like the book disappearing and like all of writers dying forever, it's not going to happen.
Mm.
Um, and like, AI is not going to destroy the novel. Like, it's just not like you just,
Yeah, there's so much sweeping change that happens with technology, but there are caps on that. You know what I mean? I think you're right. I think books have proven they are here to stay.
and
Even
like,
if maybe they go more digitized, they're still books, and I
yeah.
think even physical books are here to stay, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah. I
Yeah.
feel very sure about that. And like, um, and I just don't think it could get any worse than like, we went through a period as a society where we were like, it's fine to have really bad art because we need to police this other kind of like more political stuff. And like until like literally a new regime with a new ideology comes in and says like, oh, you're not allowed to talk about that stuff because of some other reason, we're never going to go back to like such a limited space because it was just too boring and too bad.
Mm.
And I think people have really learned that lesson. It's going to be a while before that goes back.
Right.
I kind of think it's on an upswing.
Me too. Yeah.
Agreed. What what is next for you? You mentioned that you're about to sit down on a draft that will drive you crazy, but if not necessarily that, what in terms of general trajectory, you mentioned, initially like wanting to be a novelist, and certainly you've written books in the past. What's what's in the hopper?
Yeah, I think so. Right now, I'm working on a book about Northern California, about this region called like the state of Jefferson. That's
Oh
kind
yeah.
of like it's been something I've been living on and off up there for years, and like
Mm,
nature is kind of my big thing, and it's sort of like a way of like describing America through the lens of one place, and like I have a contract for it, and
nice.
it's sort of like the big project. With that said, it's kind of like, I guess I'm kind of like in this funny zone where I have a chance now to do a different, weirder, more personal kind of writing that like I maybe didn't have back in the day because of
Mm.
some of the reasons we talked about. And so like I just had this piece come out in Granta about I went to the Central African Republic and I got
Oh
detained
wow.
by the government and I got kicked out. And so yeah, you should check it out. I
Absolutely.
tweeted it out yesterday and like really like the response has been like crazy. But it's 12,000 words or something. It's in Granta. It's in the front of the new Granta issue. And like for me, I guess like there's a kind of fork in the road at this moment where it's like I'm probably at a point where I could and should be like turning towards the New Yorker and the Atlantic and maybe the Times Magazine, big three sort of like last places that are like
Mm.
upper echelon, top. Vanity Fair too, I guess, but like can pay that $3-4 a word, can give you those contracts that can really engineer a big readership and stuff like that. And they're kind of like, then you sail off into the distance. Those are the career makers. Those are where you settle down. Um, it's just not my thing. It's never been my
Yeah.
thing. Like I've always been more like the stuff I was doing for Vanity Fair is sort of like at the outer edge of normal that I can get to.
Mm.
And so like I got to try to figure out like Granta pays me pretty well for Granta. Like they're paying me like what you would maybe think is like an actual real magazine rate, but like you can't do that stuff. You can't make a living doing that stuff. Like, and if
No.
you want to have kids and take care of that and buy houses and stuff like that, you basically have to go to the New Yorker or the Atlantic. Because even the books, like even a mid six-figure book deal, if it takes you 3 years to finish that book and blah
Yeah.
blah blah,
It's
like
not a good deal.
you're not really making middle class money. You're not certainly not making like raise a family money.
Hmm.
So like candidly, I don't know. Like, because I've sort of like made it, but like then you look around and you're like, wait, but I still have to make like twice as much money as I'm making in order to really like ever have this thing be comfortable.
Yeah.
And the truth of this business is, it's like country music. Like in this line of work, nobody retires. Like you like it kills you, or you do it till you do it until you're too senile and crazy to stop. Um, and so like I think what I'm gonna try to do is basically just like write a personal book at the same time as I'm writing this like more, like non-fictional reported book, and just like
Yeah.
see what happens. Just like
Yeah.
let that bone get exercised. And like if the money works on the personal stuff, then great. If not, like I did it and it's fine. And then I'll like start pitching the New Yorker or something. Like that's the plan.
Now, when you say personal, do you mean like auto fiction or
Yeah, I
literary
guess.
fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I rode trains. I just like I did the kind of like American hobo
Sure.
traveler truck stop life like really hard in my youth, like in a way that like I just don't think that many people in writing. It's a big thing that a lot of people have done, but not that many people who are like able to get into publishing now because it's such an elite thing, like know anything about. And
Yeah.
I actually genuinely in an artistic way like feel like it's an important project to describe that.
Yeah, definitely.
And so like I don't know if it's fiction or nonfiction. Like it's factual, but I think if you called it a novel, it might be easier to like just understand and package. So like
Yeah.
the
Definitely.
stuff that I've done is it's all true, but it kind of feels like a novel, if that makes sense. But I
Yeah, it's a
hate,
stylistic
yeah.
thing. Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know, like like male autofiction, that's still maybe a tough sell, but like whatever, we'll see.
Well, I mean, you've definitely, created a real name for yourself. And I mean, the writing that you've done on this scene, as it were, what have you, has, honestly been invaluable in terms of humanizing a lot of people who the mainstream media did not want to see that way. And yeah, thank you for that. And I think to the extent that there ever has been or there is a vibe shift, you're definitely one of the shifters.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm friends with Sean Monahan, so I'll have to tell him
Yeah.
like, look,
Myself as well.
yeah. Oh, are you okay? There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell him, look, Sean, it's not just you. Um, but no, I really appreciate that. And like, yeah, I mean, like, just as a sort of wind up, like, again, this doesn't even have to be like a right left thing or like some kind. It's like there's a whole world of people who are actually like doing interesting work, like tacos, who I think just like if you're interested in American fiction, you should probably be reading tacos. And it's
I agree.
not like we don't even have to talk about politics about whether or not it's worth talking about somebody like that as a human rather than an enemy. You know what I mean? And and luckily,
Absolutely.
in a positive way, honestly, I have not gotten in any trouble for this because I think people actually agree with that. I think people understand why that stuff is valuable.
Mhm.
Um, so hopefully more people can
100%.
do it. Yeah.
Yeah, and with regard to tacos, I mean, this is a tangent, but I have never entirely understood why he's like so radioactive anyways. I mean, a lot of what he says, he's not even, by his own admission, he's not right wing. Okay, yes, he's horny. I suppose that I think that if that is verboten, that's more an indictment of our culture than anything else.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, this is what we talk. I think there was an overcorrection, but a proper correction. Like there was some horny there, and like I mean, we're talking Brooklyn in certain years that I was there. I mean, there were some horny
Fair
guys who were
enough.
just, it was too much. It was too much. And we
Yeah.
corrected that, and there were horny, all the great American 70s guys were super, super horny. And like, all right, we corrected that. I don't necessarily think that was the worst thing that ever happened. Like it wasn't the freaking gulag, guys. It was
Yeah.
not the gulag. Like there are worse things that happened. It took some white dudes off their writing careers for a while. All right, all right. Let's just get back on it and forget about it. You know what? Like that was a correction. Now, I don't know. I think maybe tacos could get published by a major publisher.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I
I
think so
think so
too.
too.
Yeah. I think it's like, yeah, there's an overcorrection of but the overcorrection the correction, it wasn't the horniness that was bad, it was the more general bad behavior of, yeah, I don't even want to get into it or necessarily sound like a feminist myself or something, but it's the abuse of certain roles was the problem. And like that doesn't, to me, Taco's writing has nothing to do with that, even though it's extremely horny. It's nothing to do with like manipulating women and I mean, I guess there's that PUA scene. We don't need to split hairs over this, but just in short, I obviously have met him personally as well and read all the writing. And it's just he's not that guy at all.
no,
Yeah.
no, no. I mean, it's crazy. The first time I met him in person, I was like, wait, what? Um, no, but I love him. I assume he won't get mad at me for saying this, but we go to the shooting range sometimes.
Mhm.
And it's pretty funny because we both I'm not a great shooter. And we both bring 22s and plink. And then I have a handgun that I'm not great with because it's a 357 with a very heavy trigger pull, and I'm all over the place with it. So we're just like two writer guys going about amongst all the dudes with the ARs and the big guns, and we have a good time. So it's the other side of tacos.
Mhm.
Writers got to stick together.
That's true. Um, yeah, so I was just gonna close up by asking, like, where do you guys think this scene is going?
Hmm. Yeah.
Because not to turn the tables, but like,
Oh, it's
No, no,
okay. Yeah.
absolutely.
I gotta be
Yeah.
honest, I don't know that much about this scene, you know?
Well, I mean, I would say for my part, kind of the way I structured the pre-episode questions, I think that the mainstream is, not entirely going to get on board with I don't see them embrace, while I think there's no reason they cannot embrace a delicious tacos or a nutcracker or this or that. I just don't entirely see it happening because they're part of big conglomerates, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like the vibe has to shift really significantly to allow that to happen. I think what we're seeing is a sort of what was when your initial article came out in 2022, a kind of nascent thing is solidifying into something that is much more professional between Passage Press, IM 1776, various kind of, I mean, on the film side, this hasn't really taken off. You have Ben Shapiro's film
Huh.
studio, but yes,
Yeah.
there's not a ton of, well, I don't want to disparage anyone, but
It's kind of a separate thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's kind of more,
Yeah.
boomer bait, what have you. So I mean, I think there's
Well,
what
I
you're
mean, that's what Sean and Hadrian Beloved are working on.
sure,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I see kind of the emergence of a real parallel economy, hopefully, which is working in tandem with a kind of a changing tide in the mainstream, and kind of like we'll see, where they meet as they both
Hmm.
keep moving forward.
Yeah. No,
Hmm.
no, I largely second that. I do have to, sorry to say this, I have to jump. I don't want to put too sharp a point on this. I have to jump in like 2 minutes. I actually probably should have. As per me being late to this, I've been like a half hour late I've been like running a half hour behind on my whole schedule for several days now. So I do apologize.
No problem,
Just
man.
trying to make this dinner reservation. But I will largely second what Dan said. And I think, yeah, I think there's a bright future for this so-called scene, but I don't know if it will continue to be like seen as a scene, you know what I mean? I don't know if it will
Hmm.
stay unified. There are these issues. James, you were pointing them earlier in terms of people, the whole this ain't it, bro thing. As you get bigger on Twitter and these, there's going to be policing of what is and isn't based. This has already happened. This is a
Hmm.
problem. This
Hmm.
will continue to keep things messy. There's going to be infighting, but I don't think it will change the fundamental spirit of what it is. So there'll continue to be infighting like there is. It's going to continue to be messy. I agree with Dan. We're not going to see some based movie winning an Oscar next year, or even within the next 10, 20, 30 years, probably. I don't think I don't think there's about to be a New York Times best. I don't think maybe tacos will get a Penguin public. Who knows? But I don't think it'll be like a New York Times bestseller. There's still these barriers, but within that, I think there still is this tunneling from a slightly more mainstream place toward this. And yeah, I'm just kind of excited to see, obviously for personal reasons, because I'm somewhat in it, as it were. As you pointed out, or as both of you were talking about, the film, the sort of the LA element of it, and the film element feels even more nascent, like it than the New York thing. Like maybe,
Hmm.
I feel like it's
Yeah.
or in it maybe, or maybe, not that there hasn't already been some action to that here. I think it's going to keep evolving, but I don't think it's going to get snuffed out, is what I would say.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's interesting to hear from you guys because I'm sort of learning from you guys a little bit about this because I've always been a little bit on the fringe of all of
Yeah.
it.
Which is
Um,
kind of good as a reporter, right? Never to be totally of it, a thing, but rather just report on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would lose my mind if I was socializing all the time with writers.
Yeah.
And I don't say that to be cool. And this is the last thing I'll say. I don't say that to be cool. I don't say that to be like I'm above the scene or whatever, blah, blah, blah. I actually like that stuff and I like it enough that I think I would just be like a scenester. I have to like enforce myself
No,
staying away
I
from
get
stuff,
No,
that.
it's addictive. Like
Yeah.
you can even just
Yeah.
on like a micro level, like this happened the other day to me. It's like you can be at a party till 5 in the morning if you're not careful, and if if you're a reporter or a writer, like maybe you can set your own hours a bit, but like especially if you have a day job as Dan and I do, and even if you can set your own hours, like it takes a toll. There's got to be a limit on that. So,
Yeah.
it's a fire and it's a glowing fire, and that's a wonderful source of inspiration. But you can also kind of get burned or
Yeah.
lost in it,
That's
very much
very
so.
true.
Yeah.
Well, as a final thing, you this is a platform for you. Obviously you are a contributing editor to Harper's. Well, everyone should check out your writing there. Check out your Vanity Fair articles. Check out your book. Is there, anything else that you wanna juice right now?
Yeah, I mean, is there? I mean, it'd be cool if people check out the Granta piece because it'd be cool if people buy the Granta issue. It's a
Mm,
good magazine. It's been taken over by this guy Tom Meany, who's a great editor. I'm not big on the dividing somebody between based and not based, but he's
sure, yeah.
definitely not. He's definitely like someone who is talking in ways that you could have talked and done good writing in 1982, not 2014, if you understand my meaning. Like
Absolutely.
he is an old school real guy who says real stuff, And he's doing something really special with the magazine. And there's people who are sort of like me, who are kind of like bridge these things. Like there's a Christian
Mm.
Lawrence and piece of fiction in there, and he's doing really special stuff. So I'm excited about the future of that. I'm excited too. I mean, you said Harper's, but Harper's is a great magazine. I think people don't understand actually. People think that Harper's is sort of like part of this same like sort of blob as the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Times and stuff like that. And if you open that magazine, you will see very quickly that that's not the case. It has
Mm.
always been a contrarian, weird, literary kind of crotchety, this old American thing of like being crotchety, maybe a little reactionary, maybe even a
Mm.
little left reactionary. Like you like your
Mm.
old car and you just hate that Walmart, that kind of thing. That Harper's been a home for that kind of guy since 1975, and like that stuff is cool. And so I encourage people to check that out, leaving aside my stuff. But if you do check my stuff out, there'll be another thing in Granta coming up that's more like a memoir of the time that I lived in Mauritania. And
Very
nobody's going
cool.
to tweet that because it's a personal piece. So if you seek it out, obviously I'd appreciate that because it'll get some reads that it's not going to get on Twitter.
I'll tweet it.
I appreciate that. Thanks, man.
Dan Baltic will tweet it.
The Nut Army.
Exactly. We will get the Nut Army promoting it, and surely will lead the article to victory.
I appreciate that. That'll be awesome.
Well, all right. On that note, I guess I'll stop recording here, unless you have anything else.
No, thanks. Thanks for having me.